Hey everyone, in this video we'll be taking a look at countries at their greatest extent, all territory they ever held, as well as what I see as feasible greater versions of these countries. To start off, let's take a look at Ukraine. Ukraine at its height, if you only count modern renditions that went by the name Ukraine, would be modern Ukraine, or more specifically, pre-Russian invasion 2014 Ukraine, assuming we only count territories de facto still under Ukrainian control. But if you count its predecessors, such as the Kievan Rus, this would be Ukraine at its height in 1054. And if you add everything that has ever been under Ukrainian control, which is essentially just modern Ukraine on top of the Kievan Rus, you get this. Quite an impressive chunk of Eastern Europe. For a more plausible greater Ukraine, it would in my opinion be in a scenario where Russification efforts to the east of modern Ukraine were less successful, resulting in the Don Cossacks and Kuban Ukrainians remaining the dominant groups in their respective regions. This could have happened if the White Army won the Russian Revolution and Ukraine won its subsequent war for independence decisively, resulting in it gaining very favorable borders that include much of modern Russia and Belarus. Although notably it wouldn't include the today Ukrainian portion of Bessarabia, or its land beyond the Carpathians. It is of course possible that some other conflict or agreement with Czechoslovakia and Romania result in it gaining those lands. It's really hard to say though, as in this world the 20th century would have been completely different with such a weak Russia and no Soviet Union. Now let's move a bit over to Lithuania. Lithuania at its greatest extent would have been right before the Union of Lublin that formed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. To see all territory that has ever been Lithuanian, you can add modern Lithuania. As for a realistic greater Lithuania, I think it would be in a scenario where Lithuania kept central Lithuania, which was disputed during the Russian Revolution and completely lost to Poland in the Polish-Lithuanian War from 1919 to 1920. One way for this to happen is if Lithuania agreed to form another Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the form of the Intermarium. This intermarium likely would have failed as in real life, but in this scenario it would have at least included Lithuania. The union would last till World War II, and once the USSR takes over, it's possible they would have kept the larger Lithuanian borders, even if Lithuania was just a republic within the USSR. Then when Lithuania gained independence in 1991, it would of course still be a bit larger than in the real world. Now let's move over to Portugal. Portugal at its greatest extent would be in the 1800s, right before they lost Brazil. Although later in the 1900s, they did control more of Africa, so if you add that, you get all the territory ever under Portuguese control. As for a more realistic greater Portugal, it probably wouldn't be much bigger than in real life. Portugal fought tooth and nail for its colonial holdings and still lost them, so I doubt any realistic scenario would include very many colonies. It was simply inevitable for the Portuguese dictatorship to fall with the path it was taking. The people were unhappy and the colonial war was unwinnable. But Portugal on the European continent could potentially have been slightly larger. Some marriage shenanigans in the early years of the Iberian kingdoms could quite easily have resulted in a larger Portugal. But of course then the question becomes, at what point is it no longer Portugal? It would have been feasible for Portugal to become the dominant Iberian kingdom if they got into a personal union with Leon, but then the kingdom likely would have ended up being called Spain or something like that, assuming it would unite most of Iberia. And then it would of course have a different, notably not entirely Portuguese language and culture. So if we go by a stricter definition of what Portugal is, then a realistic larger Portugal would just have kept Livenza and Ceuta. This could have happened if the Iberian Union never happened, and Portugal just remained a separate kingdom till the modern day. Now let's move over to the South Slavic country of Serbia. Serbia at its greatest extent sort of depends on what you want to include as Serbia. If you want to count Yugoslavia, which really was a union between Serbia and the other South Slavs, it would be Serbia at its height. If not, Serbia at its height would be the Serbian Empire in the 1300s, which actually does come fairly close in terms of area. Adding everything strictly Serbia has ever controlled together, you get this here. And if you include Yugoslavia, you get this. As for a more realistic greater Serbia, it's difficult to say. Once again, if you count Yugoslavia, its surviving was perhaps possible, but given the ethnic tension before its collapse, it would have required some brilliant leaders that just weren't there. As for a strictly Serbian entity, it's actually a bit difficult to come up with a scenario that's fairly concise, as everything in recent history, including some miraculous victory in the Yugoslav wars, would have resulted in some sort of surviving Yugoslavia, even if smaller. Perhaps Yugoslavia never forming in the first place would have resulted in the biggest strictly Serbian nation. It would have to be in a scenario where there was never a union with the other Yugoslavs. This could result in a significantly larger Serbia, encompassing not just modern Serbia, but also Montenegro and North Macedonia. It would be possible for this larger Serbia to survive in this form till the present if the borders were re-established after the Second World War. Then again, I'm doubtful there wouldn't be some conflict over Bosnia, or maybe even North Macedonia. It is the Balkans after all. Further north is a country that has meddled quite a bit in the Balkans throughout history, Austria. What can be considered Austria at its height depends on how you want to define Austria. If you want to count the domains of the Habsburgs as being Austria, the Habsburg domains at the abdication of Charles V would be Austria at its height, as it ruled over quite a sizable portion of Europe, along with the entire Spanish Empire. If we're going by strictly Austria, it would be this, the Austrian Empire before the dual monarchy with Hungary was established. As for all territory under Austria, including the domains of Charles V, it looks like this. And as for a more realistic Greater Austria, I imagine it would be a scenario where the Treaty of Trianon was less strict and roughly followed ethnic boundaries. This would have Austria keep the German-speaking portion of South Tyrol and some of the Sudetenland, namely the part bordering Austria directly. Moving a bit east, we have Romania. Romania at its greatest extent would have been just before World War II, with their territory during World War II when they sided with the Axis powers being in a close second. Adding together all territory ever under Romania, you get this here. As for a realistic Greater Romania, I would argue it's one in a scenario where they didn't side with the Axis powers, but instead stayed neutral. This would likely have resulted in a temporary loss of Transylvania to Hungary for a short while during the war, but after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union would more than likely re-establish their pre-World War II borders. But that's about all for now. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell button if you don't want to miss future uploads. Also, thank you to all my channel members, and a special thank you to my second tier member, Lada Hino. See you all in my next video.